Hi there, it's Karen Kennedy with Real Food Matters. Today we're making clam chowder. I know, I'm a nutritionist. Clam chowder isn't usually something we teach people, but I have so many people asking me for this recipe because it's good. And I think it's an example of, there's a lot of foods that are kind of comfort foods for us that we associate with not being healthy. If you use good ingredients and you eat these things in moderation. Sure, it's a heavy soup, it's a heavy chowder. They can be really helpful, especially because we know that clams can be really high in zinc. It's nice to get a little bit of shellfish and seafood in our diet because of the nutrients it has that other things don't. So first, I want to say that I get this recipe from this cookbook, an America's Test Kitchens cookbook. I don't follow it exactly, but I follow it mostly, which is about as closely as I follow anything. It's time. So I'll tell you what I've done so far. First of all, I have taken one very large onion and sauteed it here with bacon. And first I should say that it calls for an onion and 5 slices of bacon. But I tend to ease off on the bacon, not because I don't like it, but because it's expensive. And when you buy meat the way we do, where I buy half of a pig at once, if I use all my bacon, then I'm out of bacon. So I probably use 2 or 3 strips of bacon. I just cut it off and chop it up. And I sauteed those together in a little olive oil with salt. And when it was soft, I added a few cloves of garlic. So your usual thing. And now, because you want this thick, we're going to make a roux. And so I'm using a little over 1/4 cup of white flour. And when you make a roux, you don't want lumps. And you need to cook the flour so it doesn't have that floury taste. So I just sprinkle it in a little bit. I just sprinkle it in like a tablespoon at a time so there aren't big chunks of it anywhere. And then I stir it so that the flour disappears. And I keep doing that. And then I'm going to fry the flour. And I was always taught that you need to cook your flour for 1 minute. So what I do is I make sure it's all stirred in because you want the fat coating all the flour particles. That's what makes a roux. So I've got it all spread out nicely, and I'm going to cook this for 1 minute, and then I'll give it a stir and cook it for a little longer. All right? And then I'm going to tell you what we're going to do next. Actually, what I did before. So one of the reasons I changed this recipe is that it calls for clams in a different amount. And I get my clams either from the fish market over in Ridgefield, or I get my clams from Costco. And I think my mom picked these up for me at Costco. And this is it's a 3-pound can of clams. It's huge. So that's why I scale things up. Now what I did first is I separated it. I put a strainer over a 4-cup or quart measuring cup, and I drained my clams because I'm going to use this liquid separately as the liquid for my soup, and I want to add the clams last. You don't want to overcook your shellfish, so those are going to go in last. You're not even going to see it. But I got about 3.5 cups of liquid. There's our timer. And so I'm going to stir this roux again and cook it for just about another minute. Okay. Anyways, I got about 3.5 cups of liquid, and the recipe says to bring that up with water to about 5 cups. I find with this, the way I do this recipe, for this many clams and the amount of potatoes that I'm using, I need about 6 cups of water. So I just take whatever I have, and then I add water till it equals 5 or 6 cups. Sometimes I err on the low side, and at the end, if I feel I need more liquid, then I can add more water. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is cooked enough. So it's not burned, and I've been cooking this on a medium heat. Now I'm going to deglaze my pan with white wine. Now I don't always use wine in this recipe. It depends. Sometimes if I'm cooking for someone who has a really high histamine issue, well, I probably wouldn't because of all the seafood. But you can skip the wine if you don't have it. But I add about 1/2 cup, okay, that's a cup of white wine. And I'm going to deglaze with this. The rest is just easy. You're just adding stuff. And before I add any other liquids, I'm gonna let the alcohol burn off. And the way I can tell is if I smell it and I'm like, whew, that's boozy, then your alcohol hasn't cooked off. But it's really thick. Can you see how it's like really mushy? That's the flour particles coated with fat. And then you add the liquid. That's less boozy. I think I'm okay with now. Okay, so I'm gonna set my clams aside. I think I'm doing everything right. Oh, I'm supposed to whisk this in. Let's get my whisk. I can't find my whisk. Where's my whisk? Oh God, I've got a little whisk. I totally forgot about the whisking. So use a bigger whisk than this, right? So you're gonna whisk this in a little bit, just so you don't have clumps. It's easier to whisk in a small amount of liquid. And I'm really scraping the bottom of the pan to make sure I get all the flour and all the sticky bits into my chowder. There we go. And then I can add the rest. And I'll find my bigger whisk. Oh, I think I used it in the last recipe I made. All right, so that was 3.5, so I'm gonna add a little bit more. And I'm gonna turn the heat right up. So I want this whole thing is gonna come to a boil, and then I'll simmer it, and that's when it'll start to thicken. But before I add other things, you can make this a gluten-free recipe. So we use the flour to make a roux, and what the roux does is it thickens it. So that's our thickener. Now you have some other options if you need to make this gluten-free. One way of thickening anything is some people use cornstarch, and you dissolve cornstarch in a little cold water and then whisk that into your hot water. You can do the same thing with arrowroot. Arrowroot powder is another one I like to use. Sometimes I don't like to use cornstarch. I just kind of avoid all those GMO corn products. They're probably fine. But I like arrowroot, and I'll use that to thicken. You can also use extra potatoes and take out a little bit of your not very thick chowder and blend it up with a hand blender or in your big blender to blend up all the potato and the potato starch and then put it back in. That can help thicken it too. But if you're on a gluten-free diet, I suspect you already know some tricks about how to replace wheat flour in your recipes. So while this heats, I want to add all my other ingredients, and I put them all over here. The herbs in here are thyme and bay leaf, and now this is fresh thyme because it's May and I have tons of it, but you can easily use dried thyme. And I put 3 bay leaves in there. And I also cut up some red potatoes. I like red potatoes. You can be pretty flexible about the type of potatoes, but this recipe only calls for like 3 potatoes. I use about 3 pounds of potatoes. This is about 2.5, 3 pounds of red potatoes. And I guess one of the reasons is because I use more clams, but also, when I'm making these dishes, I want to stretch them out for economic reasons. And also, I like to use a lot more of the plant-based foods. So I'm using clams, and I want to stretch that animal protein out as much as I can. So I'm going to add a lot of potatoes to that to really stretch it out. It's a bit of meat thrift. All right, I can see already that I'm going to be able to have more water in this. All right. Okay, so the last things to go in this are going to be the clams and the cream and parsley to finish it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cover this pot. And it's on a high heat. I set my timer to check it in 3 minutes. When that comes to a boil, I'll stir it again, and then I'll turn it down to simmer so this can cook. And it is about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I want to eat at 6, so that's perfect. At about 5:30, 5:45, I'm going to take the lid off and pour a whole bunch of cream in here, probably about a cup of heavy cream, maybe a little bit more. And I'm going to add all of my clams. I'll put them in the refrigerator until then. And my clams are already cooked. I just need to bring them up to temperature. And I'll add some extra salt and pepper if I need it. And then I'm going to garnish with fresh parsley because I have a lot of it right now in the garden. Okay, so that's clam chowder from the America's Test Kitchen recipe. It's great. My kids love this. Even my child who says she hates seafood, she loves clam chowder. So I hope you make it. Thanks for watching.